Imagine this. It's late at night and suddenly someone starts pounding on your front door. You look through your security camera and see police officers standing outside. You don't open the door. They keep knocking. They keep demanding that you come outside. You tell them you don't want to talk, but they refuse to leave. Now imagine you make one small mistake. You crack the door open just to see what they want, and before you can close it, an officer puts their foot into the doorway. Suddenly, the door can't shut. You're standing inside your home, the officer is standing outside, and you're caught in a situation you never agreed to. So what rights do you actually have? Can police simply camp outside your home and pressure you into opening the door? And if an officer puts their foot across your threshold, what can you legally do without turning a bad situation into something much worse? I'm going to break this down into two situations. First, what happens? When police come to your front door, keep pounding, refuse to leave, and try to pressure you into coming outside. And second, what happens if you open that door and an officer suddenly uses their foot to prevent you from closing it? These situations can feel confusing because most people have been taught to respect police authority. But your home has some of the strongest Fourth Amendment protections you have, and understanding where those protections begin can make a huge difference. Let's start with the first situation. Imagine police arrive at your house and begin knocking. Not a normal knock either. They're banging hard enough that you know they want you to answer. You don't respond, but they keep going. They're not leaving. They're trying to get you to come to the door. This is commonly associated with what police call a knock and talk. The basic idea is simple. Officers walk up to your front door, knock, and hope you voluntarily answer so they can ask questions, gather information, or potentially develop grounds for further investigation. But there is an important limitation here. Police don't automatically receive special permission simply because they are police officers. A useful example comes from United States versus Velasco. According to the case discussed in the source material, police received an anonymous tip suggesting that Mr. Velasco's home was being used as a stash house for drugs. Officers went to the property, spoke with neighbors, and found very little that actually supported the accusation. The house was reportedly quiet, and there were few signs of activity. Nevertheless, officers decided to conduct a knock and talk. They went to the front door and began knocking aggressively, and they didn't just knock once or twice and walk away. The officers reportedly continued banging on the door for more than 2.5 minutes. It was around 9 p.m., and their persistence made it clear that they weren't simply making a casual visit and leaving if nobody answered. Eventually, Velasco opened the door, but he still had a metal screen door between himself and the officers. He initially spoke with them through that barrier. The officers then began trying to persuade him to either let them inside or step outside to talk. This is where the situation changed. Velasco didn't want the officers inside his home, so instead of allowing them to enter, he decided to step outside. At first, that may have seemed like the safer compromise. He could talk to the officers without letting them into his house. But once he was outside, he realized he wanted to go back inside. So he turned around and attempted to return through the screen door. And according to the case described in the source material, the officers followed him toward the doorway, claiming they had implied consent to enter and conduct a protective sweep. That decision gave the officers access to the home. They began looking around, and they discovered a firearm and marijuana. Those discoveries were then used to hold Velasco while officers obtained a search warrant for the entire house. Eventually, he was arrested for the contraband. Think about what happened here. The officers didn't begin with a search warrant. They got to the home through a knock and talk, persuaded the occupant to step outside, and then followed him back toward the house when he attempted to return inside. That is why the Fourth Amendment matters so much at your front door. Generally speaking, police cannot simply enter your home and search it whenever they want. There are recognized exceptions, including a valid warrant, voluntary consent, or certain emergency circumstances known as exigent circumstances. A knock and talk does not automatically erase those protections. Police may generally approach your front door and knock, much like another visitor would, but that doesn't give them unlimited authority to remain there or force their way into your home. Think about your front porch for a moment. Your porch, the area immediately surrounding your home and other areas closely connected to the house, can fall within what's known as the curtilage. The important point is that the law recognizes a strong privacy interest around the home. Police don't receive a free pass simply because they've walked onto your property and are wearing a badge. The source material also discusses United States versus Cormier, where the court placed limits on knock and talk encounters. The basic principle is important. An encounter that begins as an ordinary knock and talk can become a Fourth Amendment problem if officers use their authority to pressure someone into opening the door or talking to them, or if they become unreasonably persistent. The circumstances can matter even more when officers conduct this type of encounter at night. In the Velasco situation, the officer's persistence, the nighttime setting, and the lack of sufficient corroborating evidence were important parts of the legal analysis described in the source. But what about that anonymous tip? Isn't an anonymous accusation enough for police to start treating your home like a crime scene? Not necessarily. As explained in the source material, courts have required police to corroborate anonymous information with independent evidence before relying on it to establish reasonable suspicion. An anonymous person making an accusation doesn't automatically become a reliable witness simply because they called the police. Officers need more than an unsupported allegation when they are trying to justify an intrusion. And look at what the officers actually observed in the Velasco case. They saw a house. They saw windows covered by blinds or curtains. They noticed that there weren't many cars around and that the property was relatively quiet. None of those things, standing alone, necessarily establishes reasonable suspicion that a crime is happening. People close their curtains because they want privacy. People don't have to keep several cars in their driveway. And a quiet house isn't evidence of criminal activity simply because police expected something else. The officers at the back of the house also reportedly claimed that they smelled cleaning chemicals. The problem, according to the source material, was that this information wasn't communicated to the officers at the front door before they entered the home. The front officers therefore couldn't simply rely on information that, according to the account, they didn't know about at the relevant time. The collective knowledge doctrine can sometimes allow officers to rely on information known to other officers, but the timing and communication of that information matter. So what does all of this mean for you? If police come to your front door and begin pounding on it, especially late at night, don't automatically assume you are required to answer. A knock and talk is not the same thing as a warrant. You don't have to create an opportunity for officers to enter your home simply because they are standing outside. And one of the safest ways to avoid the entire problem is to keep the door closed. That brings us to the second situation, and this is where things become even more serious. Suppose you do open the door. Maybe you want to know why they're there. Maybe you think you're doing the right thing by cooperating. You open the door, and suddenly the officer places a foot into the threshold. Now you can't close the door. You're still inside your home, but the officer has physically blocked the doorway. What do you do? Before we answer that, understand another tactic officers may use. They may try to convince you to step outside. They might say, just come outside for a minute. They may tell you they only have a couple of questions. They may assure you that everything will be quick. But stepping outside changes the situation. And once you're outside your home, officers may have more opportunities to observe your behavior, question you, and potentially develop additional grounds for detention or arrest. If you don't want to surrender the protection of your home, don't voluntarily step outside simply because an officer asks you to. If you insist on answering the door, keep a physical barrier between you and the officers whenever possible. If you have a locked screen door, keep it locked. Don't allow an officer to position themselves between the barrier and the actual threshold of your home. That physical separation can become extremely important if the encounter suddenly turns aggressive. Now imagine you've already made the mistake. The door is open and you're trying to close it. You start pulling the door toward you and the officer puts their foot into the opening. Suddenly, the officer is physically preventing you from closing the door. You may believe you have every right to shut your own door, but this is where the situation becomes legally complicated and potentially dangerous. You could argue that the officer is intruding into your home without a warrant or consent, but there is a practical problem. If you force the door closed and the officer claims that their foot was injured, they may accuse you of intentionally using force against a police officer. That could turn what began as a dispute over your doorway into an arrest or a criminal charge. So while there may be legal arguments supporting your right to protect your home, you should understand the very real risk of turning the encounter physical. The source material discusses Commonwealth versus Barnes as an example. In that case, the court found that the homeowners closing the door on an officer's foot could constitute reasonable force in circumstances involving an unlawful arrest, but that decision depended heavily on the underlying arrest being unlawful. That's an important distinction. You cannot take one court decision and assume that physically pushing against an officer will always be legally protected. Then there's Carter versus Commonwealth. In that case, the court reached a very different result. The homeowner attempted to remove police officers from the property by closing the door on an officer's foot, but the court found that the circumstances provided a basis for detention and ultimately supported the arrest. The difference between these cases is exactly why you need to be careful. The legality of the police action, the circumstances surrounding the encounter, and the jurisdiction you're in can all change the outcome. So instead of turning the doorway into a physical confrontation, focus on creating evidence and clearly stating your position. If an officer attempts to enter your home, calmly say that you do not consent to a search and that you do not consent to the officer entering your home. Don't threaten them. Don't insult them. Don't physically fight with them. Make your objection clear and keep your behavior controlled. And record the encounter if you're legally able to do so. Ideally, you want more than one source of video. Your phone can record from inside, while an exterior security camera can capture what is happening outside. Having both perspectives can be extremely valuable if the police report later describes the encounter differently from what actually happened. The source material specifically recommends having cameras covering both the front and back areas of the home for this reason. If an officer places a foot into the threshold, keep recording and clearly state that you do not consent to the officer entering or searching your home. Then exercise your right to remain silent. You don't need to explain your entire situation. You don't need to argue about constitutional law on your front porch. You don't need to answer every question simply because someone wearing a badge asks it. The more you talk, the more opportunities there may be for your words to be misunderstood or used against you. And remember, if police claim they have an emergency justification or some other legal basis to enter, don't physically fight them over the doorway. Make your lack of consent clear and document what is happening. If the matter eventually reaches court, the legality of the entry can be challenged through the appropriate legal process. The goal at the door is not to win an argument with an officer. The goal is to protect yourself, avoid unnecessary escalation, and preserve the evidence. The safest strategy is still the simplest one. Don't answer the door unless you have a reason to. If you have a security camera, you can see who's standing outside without opening the door. You don't have to announce that you're home. You don't have to turn a knock into a conversation. If you didn't call the police and you have no reason to interact with them, keeping the door closed can prevent many of these problems before they begin. But there's one major exception you need to understand. What if the officers say they have a warrant? That's a different situation. If police claim they have a search warrant, you should ask to see it and review what it actually authorizes. Depending on the circumstances, they may be able to provide it through the door or otherwise allow you to inspect it. You can clearly state that you do not consent to any search beyond what the warrant legally authorizes. If officers are legally authorized to enter, don't physically obstruct them. Stay calm, document what you can, remain silent, and contact an attorney as soon as possible. The key lesson is simple. Your front door is not just a piece of wood between you and the outside world. It represents the boundary of one of the most protected spaces under the Fourth Amendment. Police can generally approach and knock, but that doesn't mean you have to open the door, invite them inside, or step outside just because they ask. And if an officer tries to use persistence, authority, or a physical foot in the doorway to keep the encounter going, knowing your rights and staying calm can make all the difference. And if police show up at your home and start covering, disabling, or interfering with your security cameras, that's another situation you need to understand. Can police legally interfere with your cameras during an investigation? What are they trying to prevent you from seeing, and what should you do if an officer reaches for your camera? That's exactly what we'll break down in the next video. How cops use your cameras to make illegal searches.